Well, indeed, we have been blessed by the musical experience thus far today. We're grateful to God for that. And we want to say thanks to Mr. Beck and the Steel Orchestra from Walla Walla University. We appreciate your presence and participation with us here today in our service. Just joining us brings joy to our lives. I did not know, Brother Keith, that the Jamaicans had been trying to claim ownership of this history of the Steel Orchestra, but I'll just leave that out for now. You know, Reggae, Jamaica. Steel Orchestra, Trinidad. Settled. All right. We have many days to continue that discussion. It was interesting, as we pointed out a few weeks ago, the genius of people in slavery to come up with strategies to, with limited means, do essential things to get by. And it is in that context that we continue our discussion today as we reflect a little bit on how God has led all peoples and has chosen to be a blessing to all people everywhere through the history. And we said at the beginning of this month, at least we reminded ourselves of how slavery has been a scar on the conscience of the world. The transatlantic slave trade continuing for 366 years. And after the 366 years, the counting was done. Over 12 million people left the shores of Africa. And they estimate that about 2 million died along the way. And in various parts of the world, what was then referred to as the New World benefited from the labor, the slave labor of people of African descent. And that history needs not be forgotten, because it's only as we reflect and understand we are able to recognize how God can use us now to put an end to some of this evil. 15,000 people come to the United States every year as slaves. 15,000 come to the United States of America every year. They're brought here as slaves. They work in all kinds of industries. And it is important for the people of America to recognize that this scar on the conscience continues to afflict the world. At the beginning of the month, we were done. A lady came to sing, and her family came with her, and they told me, one of them said, I've just stopped using she named the brand of chocolate, because on the continent of Africa, it's slave labor that is used to produce that. We all know the story of Bangladesh and how they pay people next to nothing to manufacture clothes that come and sell here at our high-end outlets. And to make our money go farther, we benefit from that work. And so people began fussing about that. So these are some of the realities. And by the way, it's important, and this is probably important for us to recognize. Just the other day I was getting a little statistic, and I forgot to check it up because I'm preparing that for next week. But about 2% of the world's population owns 40% of the world's wealth. And here in the United States of America, sometimes we miss the point because we think it's politics. For us, it's religious. It's religious. Because powerful multi-billion corporations, when their profit margins are getting larger and larger, they're looking for ways to make it more difficult to pay people just a wage for them to get by. Washington State, for example, Boeing just signed a contract with their with employees, one of the unions, and they told them, we are going to take this away from you. It's not that Boeing is not making money. We're going to take this away from you. This is just a few weeks ago. They signed the contract. And it was like a take it or leave it for the workers. So what I'm trying to say in that simple line is, while it is not slavery, the mechanisms are in place for wealthier to get wealthier as they benefit from the contribution of people. So it's for that reason we spend some time reflecting. The passage was eloquently read by Sister Olivia Thomas. He said, God bless the ladies for saving the children alive, the midwives. And with midwives said to Pharaoh, verse 19, I'm reading a little more here from Exodus chapter 9. Midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives even come to them. Therefore, God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was, because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast in the river, and every daughter you shall keep alive. So the midwives are not helping me out. So when the boys are born, you shall cast them in the river, and the girls you shall keep them alive. That's how he wanted this to be done. And so the sojourn of Egypt begins with a feeble old man on a journey, changing his place of residence, where he was surrounded by his kinfolks, Jacob. It is a pathetic sight. A man leaving familiar surroundings, old associations, the scene of old and happy memories. He's going into a strange country. Why? Because his son was found alive, and he was now second in charge of Egypt. He was the one coordinating the food work there in the Ministry of Agriculture. He was the one doing that work. And so you can imagine his body as a silhouette against his shadow as a silhouette against the darkness that evening, and he's left his home. Family was called on a journey, and Jacob was going to be on the journey after he had been there for a while. His family multiplied. Exodus chapter 1 has an outline of the genealogy of Jacob. It is repeated many times in many forms in the Old Testament, and even a little bit in the New Testament. And sometimes we read and we wonder what that's all about, because later on Paul had his little dialogue with the Roman believers as he wrote to them, and with the Galatians also. And one of the things he got to every now and then was the fact that they took pride only in their heritage. They were not attentive to the fact that the reason they were special was because of their connection, the connection that their forefathers had and they should have had with God. And that brings me to the first thing I want to say today. Our connection with God, is the only basis for us to have pride in any heritage. In other words, it is not worthwhile to attempt to celebrate just because we have a particular heritage. The thing that we need to celebrate is how historically any group of people sought to stay connected with God. In other words, what we can celebrate today is our connection with God. That's the thing that we ought to have pride in. It is the God to whom we are connected. That's really what we want to aim for. Hank Allen writes in the book, The Black Family, when I remember, he says, I'm quoting him, when I remember the heritage of the black family, I visualize millions of fathers and mothers sacrificing themselves to promote a better future for their children. We are the beneficiaries of a heritage that can in turn be better or worse by our contributions in every successive generation. We need to remind ourselves and our children of the blood, the sweat, and the tears of our forefathers and foremothers who eagerly embraced the moral instructions God gave to the nation of Israel in the Bible. Understanding our heritage helps us to remember the ways God has blessed and disciplined our families. Family members should never forget that their lives and freedoms were purchased by the human and divine sacrifice. We will curse ourselves and our descendants if we neglect the lessons of our heritage. That is, the godly lessons of what God did for the forebears. That's what he's asking us to be attentive to. From everyone to whom much is given, God expects much to be delivered. And so the story gets to the place where, so I'm saying, first of all, our connection with God is the only basis for us to have pride in a heritage. It is the connection with God that we celebrate. And so the story continues. It says, there arose a king in Israel who did not know Joseph. In other words, Joseph is dead. It's the death of generation. It's a death of a generation. It's the death of greatness. The lives of the good and the great, they're all gone. Joseph is dead, of course. Jacob is dead. All Jacob's children are dead. This is a while after, and this new king gets up. And he doesn't care for whatever Joseph's contribution was. Joseph may have single-handedly, through God using him, may have single-handedly been significant in preserving the heritage of Egypt. Now this king comes along and he doesn't care much for this Joseph. What he cares about, he's now thinking, he is concocting stories. He's thinking up evil. What may happen if there is a war? If a war breaks out, these people, these Semitic people of Semitic heritage, they might just turn on us by joining with the enemies. That's what he's thinking about. So he says, we're going to look for a way to deal harshly with them. And while on this, maybe I should point out that sometimes we spend time talking about the great contributions of the fathers and mothers of our people. And in doing so, we forget to value and to replicate the great things that they did. Joseph is dead. When Jacob died, he gave them instructions. When Joseph died, he gave his brothers instructions. And so we are at a place where, as we celebrate during this month, it is worth the while for us to think about the contributions of our forefathers, of our foreparents. Death removes the good and the great from our number. But death needs not remove the values and the positive influences of these good and great people who have gone before. And so the story says, first of all, the connection with God was the only basis for pride in a heritage. And so a new king, it may be, the history, the Egyptian history at this time is fraught. It's real interesting because there was an overthrowing of one group of pharaohs and another group of pharaohs had taken over. And this pharaoh, the pharaoh that now took over, was not as close in kinship to the Israelites as the pharaoh who knew Joseph, as the pharaohs who knew Joseph. So they had some reason to think that maybe if there is a war, these people will turn against us. And this brings me to the second observation I want to make. And it's probably not a very good observation in this context, but it's probably a worthwhile observation. When the king, who knew not Joseph, when the political leader, who was unfriendly to Israel, took over, maybe this signaled something to them. That's the second observation I want to make. The people of God ought to seek to become detached from the dependence on all human and civil authorities whenever they practically can. It is probably for that reason that the psalmist in Psalm 146, which was read in our invocation, said, do not put your trust in princes. In Psalm 20, he says, some trust in chariots and some trust in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Joseph is dead. His example is gone. The effects of his influence are forgotten. The effects of his influence are forgotten by the pharaohs. And now there's a new king. This new king is not friendly to the church. He's not friendly to the Israelites. Maybe there is something here also for us to be attentive to. Here is a king, a despot, a man out of step with the providence of God. He was out of sympathy with the conduct of his predecessors. He is naturally selfish. He's a naturally selfish and envious man. He suspected the innocent to be guilty of the very evils he might perpetuate if he was in their position. Every now and then I listen to people wanting some new political leader to come to bear. And sometimes I myself get caught up in that because philosophically, sometimes I think some individuals are more positive towards the populace than others. For example, it seems to me, and this is every now and then I throw a little bit of this in, it seems to me as if people in our society, in an industrialized country, one of the most developed countries in the world, it seems to me as if political leaders should look for ways to make it possible for them to find help so that they can see doctors when they get sick. That's what seems logical to me, and I can defend that from the Bible. It seems to me as if that was Jesus was all about one day when he said, "The poor you have with you always. You just have me for a while," suggesting that as the poor stay with us, we ought to be attentive to them. We spend time now studying about the outcasts of society, and it seems as if Jesus' attitude was to be attentive to those who are less fortunate. So it seems to me as if a political power that is interested in looking out for the welfare of the people who are working hard ought to be encouraged. It seems to me. So I'll just leave that alone. But I beg to suggest that sometimes we get upset with these political powers. We don't want them. And then we get another one who does not know Joseph, who does not care for the values that we look for. And by the way, as Christians, our values are never going to be all in sync with the values of political leaders. As a matter of fact, it is important for us to bear in mind that we sometimes do not want political leaders to legislate our values, because God didn't ask it to be that way. It is for us to freely teach so that people will choose, if they're so interested, to follow the path that we encourage. And so my second observation here today is that the people of God, as per this story, the people of God ought to be attentive to the fact that they need not be dependent, or they need to be detached from the dependence of all human and civil authorities. And so this king became cruel. Joseph is dead. It is as if God deprived the people of their comfort and stay, that they may gain power in self-sacrifice, that they may show their ability to be independent of all human instrumentalities, that they may move into the exigencies planned for the future. People, leaders, and sympathizers, supporters, all died. And sometimes we must find a way to move on. God is the only one who is eternal. Therefore, we cannot trust in princes. We need to place our confidence in God. And so, the connection with God was the only basis for pride in a heritage. The people of God ought to become detached from dependence on all human civil authorities or powers. We should trust in God. And so now, he says for us to get by, we ought to become oppressive. Oppressive. We will become oppressors. We will enslave them. That will stop their multiplication. That will halt their development. And so this brings me to the third observation of the day. Oppression. Oppression becomes a means of education, what I may call spiritual education. They are now going to learn, Israel is now going to learn the need to become more dependent on God. When oppression becomes a means of spiritual education. Oppression taught them a few things. The oppression brought them together. They learned to live together and to come up with genius ways to succeed. They learned to see the gleam of the dawn even in the thickest darkness. Oppression taught them that they intended that sometimes the pressure does not only crush, but it condenses. Oppression taught them that the world has never crushed the people of God by persecuting them. It only made the church and the people of God more committed to God. Oppression taught them that they ought to be thinking more about God and their commitment to God. Sometimes the world's favor does more harm than its enmity. The kisses are poisonous. The world's kisses are poisonous sometimes, but its blows do not hurt, said McLaren in the Old Testament commentary on Exodus. So it's important for us to be attentive. Sometimes the oppression may help us. By the way, this, I just want to continue along this whole vein of thinking, how sometimes the oppression can have some real negative effect on the people who are being oppressed. Sean Harper, in a 2006 article in the Journal of Men's Studies, observed, he's from the Pennsylvania State University, he observes that there are certain things which reinforces certain socially oppressive assumptions. And these things sometimes eventually work their way into the psyche of the people who are being oppressed, in particular of African American men in particular, and negatively shape the way they see themselves and others within their race. And I can spend some time reflecting a little bit of that, and that's where he drew our attention to what is referred to as internalized racism. Internalized racism, simply put, occurs when socially stigmatized groups, example black males, accept and recycle the negative messages regarding their attitude, abilities, and place in society, which result in self-devaluation and invalidation of others within the group. That's internalized racism. When individuals accept the messages, the negative messages spoken about them in the wide world about them, they internalize that, and having internalized that, they start to live according to those principles that they have internalized. What are some of the effects of this internalized racism? And I suspect that some of this happened to the Israelites back then. I'll make quick observations as we move along. Failed attempts at blacks, collectivism, and excessive criticism of black leaders. Lipinski observed that also partially attributes failed attempts at black collectivism and liberation, as well as leadership decline from within the black communities because of this internalized racism. Specifically what happens, she asserts, that internalized racism oppresses and compels African Americans to criticize, attack, and have unrealistic expectations of those leaders who emerge from among them and step forward to assume leadership responsibilities. Thus, Lipinski maintains that the support needed for effective black leadership is rarely extended, which causes burnout among African American leaders. This is what I have begun to call the Tavis Smiley effect. That's what I call it. Where did that come from? Well, what I'm trying to say is that when what they're observing is when black leaders emerge, their fellow black people within the community become more hostile in their criticism to them. So one guy decided he was going to run for president, and we had some of the most hostile comments coming about him from some of the community in which he lived. I beg to observe that Moses experienced the same thing when he began leading Israel. As a matter of fact, before he assumed the official leadership position, some 80 years before he assumed the official leadership position, he went out one day and he saw an Egyptian beating on an Israelite. What does he do? He intervened. He intervened so aggressively that he had to dig a grave to bury the Egyptian. A few days afterwards, he goes out and he saw two Israelites fighting with each other. He said, listen, man, y'all ought not to be doing this to each other. They turned on him. The one said to him, you, the aggressor, who apparently was getting the upper hand on the opposition, he turned to him, he said, who you think makes you leader over us? You think we don't know what you did to that Egyptian the other day? The thing got known. Moses had to take flight from the community. And that was what he experienced from the time he returned as a leader to the day of his death. The hostility coming towards him from the people of whom he was born to love, to lead, from whom he was bred. Internalized racism. Reinforcement of internalized racism happens in the school in which some of our children go to. What is the observation they make? Instead of collectively striving to dispel some of the faulty stereotypes, what happens, especially with some young black men, is that they decided that the way they're going to be hip is by being in sports and making music and subscribe to the other things. They deliberately refuse to perform high academically because they want to be on the in-group. Their standards, popularity, masculinity, peer support, romantic relationship with the girls, that's what they're engaged in. And I read where Ford and Harris, in their observation, found that more than 40% of the participants in one particular sample were deliberately underachieving, disproportionate number of whom were men. Furthermore, the female student in the sample had significantly performed better than the men. At least a portion of these achievements was explained by their ideas of what being masculine was. They were not interested in the things, such things as academic success. They wanted the hip-hop culture and athleticism. And by the way, nothing is necessarily wrong with athleticism. I had a good friend whose children were doing very good at school, and then, they were involved in athletics, and then he showed up one day, and he noticed the grade was dropping, and he turned to the teacher, and he said, well, they're not going to play anymore. The teacher looked at him and said, well, they're performing better than all the other kids in the sports team. He said, this is not the standard that I have for them. The athletics could go, but the grades have to come up. That's what he's. So the point I'm trying to make here is sometimes the African American male high school students, they develop a strict code of conduct, what they call the masculine code of conduct. And this is characterized by some of these socially constructed attitudes and behaviors that were in conflict with academic achievements. And they loved the romantic relationships. They didn't want to develop friendships with the girls in the classes. They just wanted romantic relationships. In other words, they were looking from that early age to be exploitative in their relationship rather than develop genuine friendships. And so the effects of oppression in the mentality of the group, internalized racism, failed attempt at black collectivism, excessive criticism of black leaders, manifestation and reinforcement of internalized racism within the schools, anti-education narratives. These are the things that they come up with. In 2004, 2004, one of our very successful artists came out with Kanye West came out with what he called the college dropout. That was his signature album. And in this album, Kanye West is, y'all know that I like celebrities, so don't think that I'm trying to dung him. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to raise an interesting observation, very popular artist. And he came out with this album called The College Dropout, in which he was celebrating non-achievement, suggesting that going to college is not that important for the community. So what I'm trying to say is that this is what has been looking for opportunities to take hold within the community, so that you can go to any African American church, for example, or community, and you can just look. You can just take a visual, just listen to anecdotal reports, and you'll notice that this attitude is becoming a little more insidious, where the young ladies are eager to go off to college, but the young men are not that enthusiastic about school. The connection, and by the way, just to stay on that, others have looked at the success of African American men in colleges, and they found that some things contribute significantly to their success while in college. Peer support, participation in specific organizations such as college clubs and their churches, where the peer support was realized. Leveraging the peer support, in other words, utilizing that support to accomplish productive, helpful, and functional activities. That's how they succeeded. They succeeded by supporting each other. Supporting each other. That's how they found it. And then they used that support of each other to encourage each other to join clubs which helped them to succeed better. That's what they did. This is interesting to me from a leadership standpoint. Having been around leadership for a while, the United States military like to say we pride ourselves based on some particular things. Number one, the U.S. military said, these are the things they pride themselves on. Number one, we have never lost a foreign war. First thing. Second thing they pride themselves on is, we are the most powerful military in the world that voluntarily submit ourselves to civilian leadership. Second thing. Third thing they pride themselves on is, we do not turn our guns on our own people. We don't turn our guns on our own people. From a leadership standpoint, that always catches my attention. And it helps to illustrate something important for us within the African American community and people in all communities. There was a young lady at a certain place I used to pass, and she used to sing a song, "We don't let another wounded soldier die. We don't let another wounded soldier die." What was the point? What is my point? The point is, we as church people, as a people of a wider community, as we celebrate during African American History Month, need to learn not to turn our guns against each other, our proverbial guns against each other. Well, literally, we have turned our literal guns in cities like Chicago and Los Angeles and New York City. The literal guns have been turned on one another. Last year in Chicago, they celebrated for the first time in many years. There has been a decline in the death of young black men, a reduction on black crime. Little young lady, beautiful little lady, visited with the president, returns to her home, and some nitwits, up to no good people, opened fire and killed her while on her way home from school. What world is this? And we get up and talk about the man this and the man that. We turn our guns on ourselves. And within the church community, we need to be attentive to this also, because we cannot be turning our guns against each other. Somebody makes a mistake and we go and turn our guns on each other. Not necessary. Not necessary. And I said it from a leadership standpoint also. That's what Moses experienced from the time he took them up. He's trying to lead them. God is there with him. They notice the power of God with him. There are days when he will come down from the mountain. They could look at him, and yet every moment they had, take us back to Egypt so that we can get meat and such things to eat. That's what they wanted. The best days of Moses were the days when the leader stood by him and held his hands up. And I think that's instructive for us. And so the story says, connection with God is the only basis for pride and heritage. The people of God ought to become detached from dependence on all human and civil authorities or powers. Trust in God. Oppression becomes a means of spiritual education. They need to understand to lean more on God. And the story, he says, kill the boys. That is the point of the day. He said, kill the boys. He didn't say kill the girls and leave the boys. He said, kill the boys. The world has not forgotten this particular military stratagem up until today. Just a few days ago was the celebration of the end of the war in Bosnia. They made reference again to how one man decided he was going to empty the city. He ringed the city with the military, and they took all the men out. We listen to the news right now there in Syria. They allow folks to go in and out of homes, to bring out refugees and to take food in. All the men that came out, the government said, we need to have the men. The men. Pharaoh said, kill the boys. Kill the boys. Let me tell you, wherever the strategies come from, wherever the plans came from, to make it so that 33% of young African American men find themselves in prison, wherever the plans came from to champion that, it's got to be from the pit of hell. That cannot be of God. It can never be of God. One guy stole $7 worth of videotape from us. So that was his third strike, and we're going to lock him up for life. We eviscerate from the community the presence of their masculinity. Keep them in prison. That cannot be of God. I don't care where it came from. And we have politicians who will run for office on the fact that they're tough on crime. How are they tough on crime? They cannot come up with strategies to take care of the young people in our society, put them in prison, and they think that is their political genius. Kill the boys, because they're going to be the most capable of defending the Israelites in the event there's insurrection or war. Kill the boys, because if you eviscerate their presence and their masculine influence from the community of Israel, the power of the enemy would be more destructive. Kill the boys, because they're a necessary means for the promulgation of the Israelite race. Kill the boys, because the morale and the defense of families would be compromised when they're absent. Put them in prison. Put the boys in prison. And similar effects will be recognized in the African American community. And so it's a silent murder. It's not the thunder of war. None of that. Quiet. Just hold your hands over their faces so that they can't breathe. Hold the neck. Silently kill the boys. And then when all of that wouldn't work, he said, throw them in the river. You know why he said throw them in the river? The Nile, they consider the Nile their God. Let the Nile eat them now. Throw them in the Nile. And so this brings me to the final thing of the day. Providence. Providence prepares deliverance in the midst of wickedness, working evil. Amram and Jackie bed. One day the child was born. Jackie bed said, not this one. She looked at him, blessed child. I beg to suggest that every child is a blessed child. I beg to suggest, I've been blessing babies for years. Every new baby I bless is prettier or more handsome than the one before. Every child I meet looks smarter than when we were kids. Y'all understand what I'm talking about, old people? Well, just don't let me go so far. But the point I'm making is that there's something there. Work with me, please. Work with me. Work with me. If the evil one wanted to attack Israel by attacking the children, then maybe there is something there for those of us who are wise. The children. And so Amram and Jochebed said, this one is different. He's going to be blessed. There's not going to be too much HBO and MTV and Showtime with this one. This one's got to be delivered. The gods of Egypt not going to get him. The gods of Egypt not going to get him. My God's got to get him. And so the girl, you know the story, the girl just stands by and she watches him. One day he's there in the Nile. And then the daughter of Pharaoh comes down to have a bath. She is so full of her own religion, she thinks the Nile has bred for her a son. We never know his name. We don't know the name Amram and Jochebed gave him. Moses is the name she gave him. We don't care what name she gave him. He was a child of God. And so providence is working deliverance in the midst of wickedness, working evil. Providence. And so they dragged him from the Nile. The girl ran up to her and said, you want me to find a lady to nurse him for you? You know, these Israelites ladies, they know how to take care of these kids. She looked at her, she said, you know somebody who can help me nurse him? I said, yes, I know somebody. So okay, I'm gonna pay her money to nurse this child. And she ran, go get mama. Mama. The king's daughters got Moses, got her brother. And she runs down there, she says, what you gonna pay me? She'll do it for free. What you gonna pay me? Pay you such and such and such. And she took the child 12 years. All she needed, 12 years. She got so much of the word of God, the Torah has been in him so much, he goes out there. He never forget who he was by faith. Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the sons of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. He had an understanding of God's hand in his life. Still emerging. Still emerging. Still emerging from the struggles of oppression. Brothers and sisters, we give ourselves to God. We give our lives to him. It is Lord God Almighty who is going to help us deal with the struggles of oppression. Let's place our hands in God. That's what we want to do, so that this God of our silent tears, this God of our weary years, will help us get through, because he's working deliverance in the midst of wickedness, working evil. Oh God of heaven, bless your people. Deliver us, we pray, always. In Jesus' name, amen.